kinds of buildings should be built and things of that nature, but really to talk about all the ideas in the community that make this the place that people want as their home. And this is the quality of life discussion that people are going to have with us. And from that, we should be able to produce what I would think is a pretty effective plan. This is a long process. The team will talk about that. And we are anxiously awaiting our appropriation so we can then move forward, finalize UTL's contract. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Iram, and we will move quickly through the process.
Thank you very much, Rich. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And so it's actually very exciting for us on the staff side to be able to be here with UTL, because this feels like the real kickoff of the process now that we have the consultants with us today, but we do have the formality of getting our appropriation and getting their contract signed. So we will be back to City Council to talk about that on Monday, but if you have questions about it, we're happy to engage with that as well. So just to remind everybody, we're looking for a $3.3 million appropriation that includes the consultant fee, but it also includes enhanced staff capacity as well as elements to support a high level of engagement that we are looking for this project. It's going to be a three-year process, and it's going to look at all of the things that a typical master plan looks at, land use and urban design, transportation, but it's really also going to zoom out and emphasize elements like long-term environmental sustainability. It's going to look at social equity, and it's really going to think about what are our values as a city, and how are we going to get there? What does Cambridge mean to all of us? And then, based on that understanding of our shared values and our shared vision for our city, determining what do we need to do in terms of policies that look at a whole range of things from land use, urban design, transportation, sustainability, housing, which we hear increasingly about, public services, infrastructure. So it is going to look very comprehensively at all of the elements of the city, looking out roughly 20 years. And then, again, like I said, it needs to be guided by the community. So all of us in the room, and then all the people who are not in the room today. So Tim Love from UTL will talk as we move forward about their engagement strategy, and one of the reasons why we're so excited to have UTL on board is because they bring tremendous expertise in engaging a broad sector of the community and in bringing the unheard voices to the table so that everybody can participate in decision making. So with that, I'm going to actually turn it over to Melissa Peters, who is our project manager for the city on this process, and she's going to talk a little bit about the schedule for the project.
Thanks, Iram. As Iram said, this is a 3-year process. We anticipate kicking off this fall. And we've organized it around 3 phases. The first phase being research and visioning. Research, this is when the consultant team will analyze the various planning themes that Aaron mentioned, mobility, energy, resiliency, open space, economic development, to name a few. We'll also be developing a shared vision with the community. That'll bring us to phase 2, where we'll develop scenarios that bring together that shared vision based on what we hear from the community, and ultimately phase 3, which is plan development, where we'll be developing a path forward with a concrete action plan of recommendations to implement the shared vision. I want to emphasize that engagement will be happening concurrently throughout the entire process. We're very excited to have the UTIL team on board. They have a menu of both analog and digital tools that really will help to engage people that don't normally come to the table. Alewife will be an early action item. We anticipate starting the Alewife district study this January with initial research that will ultimately get folded up into the citywide plan.
All right, so if you have any questions on this piece, we're happy to answer those. Otherwise, we'll turn it over to Tim Love to really delve more deeply into UTIL's proposed approach and some of the tools that they'll be using during the course of the process.
All right.
Thanks. First, I should describe a little bit our.
Oh, yeah, just go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Tim Love. I'm the principal in charge of the project, and I'm the founding principal of UTIL. We're a 45-person architecture and planning process located at Downtown Crossing. We've been working with the city staff on the schedule, the detailed scoping of our planning effort, and have also been looking at efficient and meaningful ways that the different experts that we've brought together can work on the plan with us. As you can imagine, it's given all of the items and issues we want to address that Iram mentioned, we have a lot of sub-consultants. We also have the core members of our team here tonight. Maybe they could stand up for a second and I'll introduce them. Will Cohen, going from left to right. Mira Dian, and Dan Doka from Interboro. The only person on our core team who's not here tonight is Kelly Linema, but I'll be working very closely with that group of 5 on a day-to-day basis, working with the city team, working with all of you, and working with all of our sub-consultants. We have an amazing group of experts as part of our team, landscape architects, economists, engineers, people that are going to help us with the engagement effort, public artists. I won't discuss any of those in any detail, but I think our proposal is still online. And if you're interested in the details of any of the other people on our team, I invite you to look at their qualifications and some of the past work that they've done. We've got those sub-consultants in a couple of buckets just to help us think about the roles they play. We have the analysts on the left, people helping with the economic development and the sustainability strategy on the lower right. And then we have a crack engagement team that's working with Dan and the UTIL team for some of the things that we're going to do. Why do a citywide plan? It's probably worth reminding you all again of what we call the top 4. Establish a comprehensive shared vision for Cambridge. This has all kinds of advantages in terms of setting priorities for policies, linking policies to land use reform if we decide to do that. And it also picks up on the Cambridge Conversations effort and really formalizes that so that gets packaged in a way that's the most useful for the city. As Iram mentioned, we want to create the most inclusive possible citywide discussion. This is both because it's the right thing to do, but because the kind of information that we get will enrich the plan. I'll be back to that in a second. The other thing we want to do is come into a lot of processes that are going on, all of which are excellent, and make sense of them more holistically relative to citywide goals and objectives. So in a way, we'll be coming in as the kind of the soft editors for those initiatives that are happening. And last, and equally importantly, I think that there are advantages to thinking about growth and change at a citywide scale rather than just letting the market decide where those decisions are made. And that's a more nuanced issue than that, but hopefully through the presentation I can explain what I mean a little bit. We've proposed a wide menu of engagement strategies, as Iram said, from the digital to the analog and back again. We're in the process of planning these at a higher level of detail. And what we'd like to come back to at the end of my presentation is ask all of you, both who you think the communities are that maybe aren't typically part of these planning processes, and secondly, what ideas that you might have for us to engage those voices that maybe aren't at a meeting like this tonight. So we'll come back and we can talk about some of our ideas in detail, but we'd like to hear from you first. As I mentioned, there's a lot of excellent planning happening at the city, either recently completed, still ongoing, or almost finished. We see our role to both consume and understand all of these plans, but in a way to organize them in a way that they can be communicated collectively, but so that also they can point to, in the crossovers between them, some priority initiatives in terms of policies as part of this plan. And so I'm sure you're as familiar or even more familiar with some of these plans than I am, having not been engaged in this process yet, but we have two staff download sessions over 2 different days to get the full story on these plans. One's scheduled for next Monday afternoon, and the second next Tuesday afternoon, I think. So that's the official kickoff of our process in terms of doing the research. But we're going to be looking at the issues and topics as part of this planning process in these 5 buckets. These were defined by the city as part of the RFP process: climate change and the physical environment, urban change, economic development, housing, transportation, and mobility. And you can see the sub-issues that are in the same bubbles with those the kind of lead topics. There are 2 kinds of things that connect those topics together. One is the general citywide goal through the lens of the planning process to aim for social cohesion and equity across all the choices that we make as part of the policy making that we do as part of this planning process.
Tim, can Craig just ask a quick question about something that you just...
Thanks, Tim. As you go through this very interesting presentation, you mentioned the city's scope of work and whatnot. Is this stuff carved in stone, or when we look at it, should we be thinking that there are some things we might be able to change?
It's an excellent question. What does carved in stone mean?
So we had this process when we had put out the RFP, where we solicited comments from the community and the council and the planning board. And so based on that, we have been refining the scope with UTO, and the budget appropriation that is before you is based on this scope of work, which doesn't mean that we cannot modify things around the edges, but any big change will have implications on the budget.
Yeah, and I think that planning processes are typically scoped with big bucket scope items, but flexibility built within them as things are discovered during the planning process. That's another way to answer it.
Thanks. I don't want to hold you up, but so in terms of those subcategories in each circle, are we to assume that there are subcategories of the subcategories? You know, because when I look at, one of the things that we've talked a lot about is, and we're talking about, and I bring it up again, is universal preschool, which is something that is going to be a big budget item and a big part of where we're going to put these programs and whatnot. So not seeing it up there specifically, do I assume that that falls under what? Into one of these other areas, or does that mean it's not going to be part of the discussion?
So Councillor, it's, I think that this team brings expertise in a wide range of topics. I think we would, on things like the universal preschool, we would work a lot with the staff resources that we have, who are much more knowledgeable on that particular topic. So I think we can totally knit that into the work that is that's ongoing. And if it turns out that there is a need for analysis that is that is broader than what the team brings forward, we can certainly come back and have that conversation with you. But I think the other way to think about it is, what are the components of that are up for discussion, that are up for question right now, where we could use the UTL team's expertise. And if it's about how we accommodate facilities, then we can certainly think about that. We have that expertise on the team. But if it's about what is, from an educational perspective, the right thing, that's not expertise that this team has. So
Right, I wouldn't expect them to do anything about programming, but if we're talking about, we're going to need X number of centers throughout the city, and when we're planning, we're going to zone a certain way, then that, I would want to see something like that as part of the plan, but not the program.
Yeah, and the mobility piece is going to be key too, walk sheds and that kind of thing too. So I think where it affects the menu of things in those dots, we certainly would be happy to fold that into the planning process. I should just say before I move on that in addition to those topics and the subtopics, there are both goals that unite them, and social cohesion and equity is a big one, aimed at with the civic engagement process that we're using, but also the tools that we use as urban designers and planners, the modeling that we do, the scenarios, the data analysis. And I'm going to share some examples of that tonight as well, so you know the kinds of deliverables we'll be bringing to the public discussions moving forward. Does that make sense in terms of this slide? As was mentioned, we're going to be focusing in on an alewife district study relatively earlier in the process, and that we embrace that, even though it's a little bit out of sequence relative to a more linear plan, because it allows us at a finer grain to look at those 5 buckets of issues and the actual physical implications of some of the choices because of the scale of alewife. And while we're not completely up to speed on all of the issues in alewife, we've started to think about the issues and fruitful cross-fertilizations between some of those content categories. For example, the relationship between resiliency and open space, questions of transportation, questions of development versus preserving existing neighborhoods. And so it's going to be, it's both important to get at alewife relatively quickly, but it's also a great test case in terms of our methodology for other places in the city. And so just a little bit more detail there, you'll see that we're going to be mobilizing the alewife plan just after the first of the year, after we get the general conversation going enough that we set the stage for the entire citywide plan. And then that will have a kind of proto-conclusion next September, but then we'll get tweaked and modified as we're working on the rest of the plan and other potential focus areas in terms of the overall process. And otherwise, I think Iram covered and Melissa covered the big categories of the schedule pretty well, but we can come back and answer some questions about that if you want. In the next 6 months, these are our action items. We're going to be crowdsourcing the name of the plan. And we have, I think that survey is going to be announced soon, right, Melissa? As I mentioned, we're having a download with the city staff of the ongoing processes, which is not a minor matter. That's a lot of content for us to both learn about, digest, and even organize in some structured way. We're going to launch the project website. We're going to help advise on the creation of advisory groups. And we're going to dive into citywide research and analysis, some of which I shared at the public meeting, and some of which I'll share a little bit tonight. We haven't gotten too far into that, of course. We're also going to initiate a citywide visioning and engagement strategy through a wide range of media to start to get back at the questions about priority setting that were started with the Cambridge Conversations. And I mentioned mobilize the alewife plan. So I now wanted to show you a range of tools we'll be using at different points in the process, some of which we presented at the public presentations during your selection process, some of which we've done just based on some early hunches, and some of which is based on relevant projects, just to show some examples. The first is that we're going to, at a finer grain than this map, look at and analyze data across the city as a whole. This is a quick analysis that we did of, in different census tracts, the percentage of rental households, which tell a couple of stories. One is that you'll notice that a higher percentage of census tract with rental households happen to be clustered right around the universities, no surprise there. But it also tends to be an income indicator. And one of the things that we want to do is, through a finer grain analysis, understand that differentiation a little bit and what it means relative to demographics, real estate pressure, and what policies might do to rectify this condition if necessary. We're also going to be visualizing other kinds of data. I think that everybody here is well aware of the productive mode shift from 42% motor vehicles in 2000 to a 32% mode share of motor vehicles last year, with increases in bike ridership, use of the subway, buses, XYZ. This has...
Go ahead.
This is a question that's near and dear to my heart, but bike ridership seems incredibly seasonal and weather dependent. So I don't know where to put your data. Is that an average, or is that based on one calendar year, or how do you get that information?
I'm going to turn this over to my data guru, Will Cohen, in the back row. Will, you're up. Sit here.
We just pulled these numbers out of the American Census, and so this is based on surveys that the United States government sends out to residents, and it's self-reported information that gets modeled out statistically for the city. So I think it's averaged across the year, but there's not any specific time frame besides the years they collected it in.
But what we haven't had the opportunity to do yet is, Cambridge is a data-rich city. We haven't yet, because we're not under contract, had the opportunity to, in addition to learning about the past reports, do a data dive with city staff about what's available.
Oh, okay, thanks. So I think, and I just want everyone in the room to understand that, when we're talking about data, we have to be absolutely sure we understand where it came from, what it means, what its holes might be, and so forth. And we need to do that early on in the discussion, because if we're having planning discussions in a year and a half, then people are still trying to figure out what the data means and where it came from and so forth, I think we'll wind up with a really hollow plan. So that's a cautionary tale, I think, for all of us. Thanks.
And I think we have a small source thing, but I think you're right, we'll make a more robust, more detailed, in the lower right of every slide, a more detailed, robust description of the data moving forward. This is important because it's going to affect both citywide policy and targeted decisions about the real estate of the public realm, relative to pedestrian accommodation, bike accommodation, hubway accommodation, bus accommodation. We live in a world, for the most part, in Cambridge with fixed dimensions, and this requires a robust public discussion about priorities against not only data, but also real traffic data. So we have Nelson Nygaard's on our team, a transportation consultant, and we plan to dive into these issues with some level of detail. We're also, to show you the range of things that we're going to look at, very interested in economic development issues, especially around job retentions and job creation. HRNA is on our team. They're a nationally known strategy and economic development group. And so, again, doing some quick analysis to put some more detail to some hunches. We looked at job trends across a period of 20 years and mapped the number of employees for the top 25 employers in each of the job sectors. And so this is a story that everybody in Cambridge is familiar with, but it's nice to see it graphicized. The drop-off of Polaroid, Cambridge Technology, Modern Continental, Grace Construction dropping down, the relatively, on a per-company basis, relatively even profile for tech companies, but what's important is that this is not cumulative, but it's all of the companies that are in the top 25, and you'll see that there are more and more tech companies in more recent years stacking up. And then no surprise, the growth of biotech and life science over the course of the same time frame. So yeah, I'm not prepared to interpret this information yet, but it's important to understand that we plan to, as part of the engagement process and the public debate, use visual tools like this to take indecipherable data like this and turn it into something that people can actually talk about and engage with. The other thing that we're going to do, and we're going to do this first with Alewife, is develop alternative scenarios for development on those sites that are deemed either development ready or development vulnerable, depending on your opinion. And so what we can do is that we can model development scenarios using a parametric model tied to a way to manage and understand the outputs in a way that can even be live. So we can make buildings move up and down, see the number of units, the number of jobs change instantaneously, and also we can watch the differences between financial implications for the city in terms of tax base and that kind of thing. We did that recently for the city of Somerville for Boynton Yards. These are two different scenarios for that area that come up with basically the same metrics, but do it two different ways. In other words, if you look at the number of jobs, or the number of dwelling units, and the acres of open space, they're roughly equivalent, but one includes a large public park and taller buildings, and the other includes shorter buildings and smaller scattered open spaces. And so these were part of the public discussion for the larger Union Square neighborhood plan that we were involved with. And so we're imagining for Alewife that we'll be using similar tools, if not similar kinds of buildings, to engage in an actual discussion. And you can see these are total revenues and expenditures over a 20-year build-out in this case. So those are 20-year numbers, just to go back and forth again. We'll also use a similar strategy to drill down into different visions for the public realm, including the streetscape and open spaces. You'll see that these two scenarios have different visions for a park, allocation of sidewalks, streets, and that kind of thing. So this isn't coming to the process right away. It will be part of the last phases of Alewife, and then other areas we decide to drill into later in the process. So I think that summarizes what we're going to be doing, what we're going to be up to, and the tools that we're going to be using. I wanted to come back to our engagement process, because that's the first thing that we're going to launch when the plan gets going. And we've proposed a variety of strategies, including online surveys. We're going to have street teams that are going to go out and do on person in the street surveys. We're going to do some activities that are geared more to young people. We're going to have tours and walks to demystify planning by making it clear to people that want to listen what planning choices of the past have resulted in the physical things that have happened in Cambridge. But I think we'd like to ask the council some questions, if you don't have any more questions for us, about maybe the best way to do this.
Mr. Mayor?
Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. just have a couple comments and a couple questions in my remarks here. It was last week we had an appropriation of $3.3 million from the city manager before the council. And my right as a city councilor, I exercised that charter right to put off that appropriation till the next meeting, because I knew we were meeting here in the roundtable, and I thank the mayor for having this roundtable discussion where we can get into the nuts and bolts of this discussion. I know some people felt it was some kind of a devious maneuver, but it's, but that's the inaccuracies that we face on a daily basis in the city from certain individuals and groups, but that's for another story. And as you know, I've had concerns about this, Mr. Manager, since the beginning, and my first concern, obviously, is the cost, and I think it was just a couple of months ago, the price tag was $2 million. Now it's $3.3 million in a matter of months that it's increased for a 3-year study. And I would venture to say before this is over, if it's approved, it will be close to $6 million that we're going to be spending on this master plan citywide. And to me, that's a very hefty price tag, seeing the demands of the city, many other programs, human services, education, affordable housing. I just have a lot of concerns of spending what I think is going to be $6 million, and I'm sure that's going to be more and true if this is approved and goes on. But I appreciate you being here, and I know, you in your comments in the interview process and with the manager's discussions, you talked about past studies. So I guess my question, first of all, is on the past studies, how they will be incorporated. And I know you have said that there have been many past studies throughout the city, and we've done many planning studies. So the notion, or I should say the false notion, that we haven't been doing any planning in the city of Cambridge has always bothered me. We have countless studies on the shelves that represent hours, days, weeks of time of staff, and even more importantly, the residents that have participated in this. If there's an issue, we have a study. And these studies set us up in certain parts that made Cambridge very successful. And I want to make sure we're not abandoning those studies. And I kind of wonder why, especially the residents, the staff, they're paid, city employees. But most importantly, the residents who, over the past 10, 20 years, have devoted many hours of time and effort to these studies, and they're just being put on the shelf. What do you think is now going to make them to participate? What is the guarantee that what is going to come out of this? So I just don't want to be spending people's time and effort. So I'm really concerned about that. You've said that in your analysis before when you submitted your bid. So can you help me understand better how those past studies were incorporated, and in fact that something like this will be implemented, or is it going to be that certain groups will, we don't like that study, so we want to do something different, another study. So when does it end, I guess, is my question. So, and I hope to see if you can help answer that.
Well, I can, should I take a stab first? Yeah. I mean, I think that, let's say the challenge with that list of studies that I had up there is that they were each done very carefully in a very sincere way, but just through the lens of the topic sentence. And they don't provide collectively a roadmap for how the city might think about land use policy and permitting vis-a-vis development pressure as a collective vision. And so what I mean by that is that a lot of the improvements to Cambridge happen in two buckets. One are publicly funded projects that might be the result of a MassWorks grant and some city funding for streetscape improvement. A lot of the civic realm that's improved or social programs that are done around issues of inclusionary housing, affordable housing, are also paid by development itself and the benefits package that comes with a development project. What we hope to do with this, one of the things we hope to do with this planning process is both to make sense of all those plans for the citizens at large, in a way that makes all of those topics make sense under the arc of a single narrative. Because even a planning professional sees that list and the mind reels, right? To make sense of all that so that the entire city is engaged in all of those issues that are on that list of plans, but also to use the plan as a way to educate everybody in Cambridge about how the development process works financially and how choices are actually made about whether a development process prioritizes open space or affordable housing or a contribution to this organization or that organization. And what we want to do is we want to make as many people in Cambridge understand the relationship between land use planning policy, the permitting process, and choices that are made as possible. And that requires understanding all of the other issues that development has to deal with, including complete streets, including housing policy, including decisions about who's going to pay for resiliency moving forward, the public, or each developer one at a time. There are major issues that Cambridge is going to be faced in the future that requires literally a public-private deal being made so that there's one cohesive set of policies. But I don't know if that doesn't answer your question directly, but maybe it's an appeal that, especially given development pressure in Cambridge today, and new issues like resiliency and sustainability, there's some hard decisions that the city needs to make collectively.
I appreciate those comments, but I would just add before I go to my next point. The East Cambridge planning team did this for free. It didn't cost millions of dollars to do what has taken place in that neighborhood between North Point and Kendall Square. That was between the residents of the city. It didn't cost several $million. But I appreciate those comments. My other comment and concern really is how the Fresh Pond Wildlife District study is going to look as it relates to the rest of the city. And again, for some contextual background to my concern, and I think it was in 2001 when we had a similar study completed about East Cambridge development. That was the ECAP study. And it wasn't that long ago that Kendall Square and East Cambridge look very similar to the current state of allied Fresh Pond area. Right. And as a result of the ECAP study, which was with the city and the residents, they made the decision, a very constructive decision, about housing overlay districts that encourage conversion of all the buildings and factories to make space for the new residents, and it's been very successful. We've attracted many new residential units, many new residents added to the fabric and the life of Kendall Square, which everybody wanted at 24/7, and that was done with non-home input for free. And they've become part of East Cambridge, those residents. And along with that came additional commercial development. And as we all know, for years, that development in Kendall Square and East Cambridge has benefited the entire city in terms of the amount of money, tax money that's come into the city. And it's proof in the tax bills that I think just arrived in the mail today of how low the taxes are in the city. So my issue now is that now that very similar development has moved to other neighborhoods like Alewife, that all of a sudden we have to put the brakes on, the red flags. The development impacts in East Cambridge were okay, but now that we're moving on to other areas, we need to spend, I'm going to say $6 million to make sure it is okay. So I want to know how, now that we've been looking at how this area can reach its full potential, I just want to see that scale back because of the anti-development wave that seems to have surged in that particular corner of the city. The city benefited from East Cambridge development. Now I want to see how other areas of Cambridge can ease the strain on real estate demands in East Cambridge and the port. I certainly hope I'm proved wrong, but I I found the results of our life study when compared citywide will result in denser developments in East Cambridge and higher percentages of affordable housing there, while other areas will be able to maintain the status quo. And the perfect example is this. Earlier this year, there was a building in our life before the planning board, I'm sure they remember, that was under pressure for the reduction in height. And the same worked. At that meeting, those who were advocating for a lower building in our life were suggesting, and I think it was at the same planning board meeting, that developer asking to reduce the size of a building at North Point should reconsider and make it higher. So it's good, okay to make it higher down in East Cambridge, but lower in the other part of the city. And this is why I get very uncomfortable and uneasy feeling, to be quite honest with you, because I've been here for a while and I've seen it and I've heard it, and so I wish you all want to be working with them, not sure run for the appropriation, but I just want you really, I can't stress enough that you and the city and your team to really take an equitable look across the city. You know, while all the neighbors in Cambridge are indeed different, we share the same benefits of a successful Cambridge, and the reverse of that should also be true if we share the same goals, like affordable housing, that we should share those efforts in all parts of the city, those goals. So I wish you well, it is a challenge, and I'm sure, like as I said, you know, we've done more studies, we've had them out there, and I just don't want to be hoping spending $6 million, and then because the results is not what some people like, that we have to go back and start over, and that scares me, and that, I wouldn't want that out at all, to be honest. So, I don't know what guarantee that this people, you know, this is going to, I'm not going to say the be end all, but, you know, if you add up, I'm sure it's probably how many millions of dollars over the past days, starting from ECAS, starting from back in
East
down the river,
East Cambridge River.
so there's been many millions of dollars spent, and I just, you know, it's a challenge to keep families in the city, and you know, $6 million to me is a lot of money to be spending. So those are my comments, my concerns. I just want to lay it out there, and we'll gladly follow up with any kind of discussion with you at any time with your staff and the city staff. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. We will, I think the goal here is to make sure that there is, that we're looking at the whole city through a uniform lens and looking at the competitive advantages of each part of the city and customizing solutions based on that. But I did want to say, in terms of the dollar amount for the contract, or the appropriation, I'll say that before we submitted the appropriation to the council, we had to go through Louis D. Pasquale to get there, and he had concerns similar to yours, that we not go beyond, yes, he's right there, that when we say $3.3 million, that we are saying that as a really firm number, and he made sure that we were looking at not just the consultant contract, but all of the ancillary elements that go along with it. So when we say we're going to have this really robust public process, and we say we need, along with that, some meetings where we can offer childcare and translation, he asked us to make sure that we were factoring in all of those things in here. So when we bring you this number, it includes all of those pieces. And from the staff side, we have been very firm with the consultant to say that the contract number is not really something that we intend to see changed as we go along the process. We don't want to be coming back to the council in year 2 with another appropriations request for this process. So they understand that very well. And so that's the one thing, that the responsibility that lies on us is that we'll have to be careful that we manage the scope, that Melissa will be careful to manage the scope very carefully to make sure that we are not stepping beyond the 3.3 that we are requesting.
Dennis.
Remind me what the CD budget is on an annual basis? Just ballpark, within $1 million. Now I apologize.
Then I'm going to need to look this up because off the top of my head, I cannot remember.
Okay, Louis knows it. Well, I was going to say over 5 million. Okay, I apologize. So the whole community development budget is about 5 million, 6 million. Maybe we can get it up to 7 tomorrow. Maybe it goes down. So this study is about $1 million a year for the 3 years. That's about 0.3%, 0.3 of 1% of the city budget, and it's about 1/6 of the planning office budget, but it is for a large comprehensive study with the goal of doing whatever happens in the future to do it in the most efficient way. What I mean by that is, if we want to maximize affordable housing, how do we maximize affordable housing? If we want to improve transportation, is it 7? 1/7 of the, it's getting better as I talk. If I keep talking, it might even go more. That's it. So yes, it sounds like a lot of money, but given the effort and the scope of this study, this is comprehensive. I've been here for 41 years. The city has never done this. So this is the first time the city is taking on this effort. Yes, we've done pieces. Yes, we've done very good studies. I recall one on the riverfront in East Cambridge years ago, but never looking at the whole apple. And we can come out ahead in so many ways on this. So no one is cutting back on development. I've not seen any cutback on development. I've not seen anything turned down in favor of the master plan. That was never the intent. Certain people might have said that was the intent, but nobody on this council said that was the intent. One of the things about many previous studies is they were never translated into urban design and studied in that way, and then looked at the zoning. And that's what this study has the capability of doing. The big picture is wonderful in the sense that you can look at big picture items which we never look at in individual district studies. Transportation, flooding, the whole infrastructure, open space citywide. All of a sudden, this becomes elements that we can talk about. The one thing that I didn't hear about, although I did see it mentioned once in UTIL in the city's presentation, is urban character and the parametric I'm changing the subject. The parametric three-dimensional diagrams show floors, but and I know Tim and his team knows this, but I want to emphasize that the character of the buildings goes a long way in what feels friendly and inviting and what feels cold and disenfranchising. So I'm sure that will be the case. But the beauty of this is we're going to pay money for a look-see at the whole city, and knowing that we only have certain development opportunities left, realistically, that how is the best way to develop that to meet the city council and neighborhood and development goals. You know, maybe it's once in a lifetime, but this is the time. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you. In terms of, I want to talk a little bit about the community involvement piece too, but just to kind of follow this train a little bit. You know, I'm glad we're doing this process. I certainly want to spend what we need to spend to get the proper result. I think the worst thing that we can do is kind of do this halfway. And I think part of the frustration, and this sort of leads to my question about outcomes, I think part of the frustration from folks in the community, and certainly I've heard this about Alewife, and it ties into the fact that we do have plans, we just don't necessarily follow the plans once we have them. And they do sit on a shelf, right? And that's the part that's frustrating, whether that was C2 or K2 or the Alewife study or anything else, is that you go through this whole process, you spend time, you spend money, you ask people to be involved, and then what happens? And so I think, what is going to determine the success of this and whether or not this is money well spent, obviously, is the plan itself, but it's also what we do with it, right? And if we spend $3 million or $6 million and we get this beautiful report and then we don't enact any of the things that that the plan is suggesting, then it's going to be a failure, and that'll be a shame, and I think we can't do that. So I think in terms of what the community can expect, what we can expect, I was glad to see the different areas that are going to be covered, because one thing that I've said before that always concerned me is that when something came up in the council that we weren't quite sure what to do with, we said, oh, well, we'll cover that in the master plan. And I'm afraid it's going to become this, catch-all, right? So can you just talk a little bit about, what's the finished product going to be like? What is the intent of the product? What is it that people can expect? And then, maybe this is further on, but how are we then going to use that moving forward? I just, if $6 million for a plan to sit on a shelf is not what I'm interested in, or $3 million, right? Somewhere in that range. Whatever it is, $1 million for a plan to sit on a shelf is $1 million wasted. So, can you talk a little bit about what the expectations are, and then how we're gonna...
We're not getting paid.
I just want to start, and then I'll give it over to Tim. So I do want to say that, we always say plans sit on a shelf, and that's because they're books. But the thing is that they are also utilized. And when we talk about all of the planning that we have done, some of the examples are ECAPS, K2C2, Concord Alewife. Those have all been translated into zoning that was adopted by the city council. And then they all have design guidelines. So when somebody brings a project, the project gets evaluated as one project, but it's evaluated in the context of the zoning that's based on the plan, and then the design guidelines that are based on the plan. So while we don't always pull out the plan, the thing is that it's really embodied into the context that the planning board uses for their evaluation of every project. There's transportation analysis that goes along with every special permit project. That entire provision resulted from the last time we took a citywide look at Cambridge back in from late 90s ending in 2000. So really the context that we have today is a result of all of the planning. And the thing is, you adopt it, you do it as one large piece, but then it only gets implemented incrementally. And no matter how wonderful the planning process is that we do now, it will still, the implementation will have to happen incrementally. So with that, I'm going to just turn it over to Tim, who understands still that he's not getting paid $6 million.
This has been a wonderful meeting so far. I think this hits the nail on the head, which is that we're going to, through the whole process, we're going to have an eye on the kinds of outcomes that will be impactful. One is changes or reform to land use policy in Cambridge. It might be revisions to zoning. It might be an amping up of design guidelines if the people demand that. It might be clear guidelines about at different scales, the distribution of development benefits relative to inclusionary zoning, but maybe a wider menu of things if we decide that that's the right policy path moving forward. It'll also, I suspect, lead to a case that Cambridge can make with MassDOT relative to T-service, improvements to Route 2, some a collaboration with surrounding towns about transportation issues that move outside of your borders, MassWorks grants for targeted streetscape projects that might be prioritized because they were in the plan and tied to other economic development strategies. So whenever we're doing plans, even at the earliest stages, we're thinking about the goals and the principles idealistically, but we also have an eye on where this is all headed, because what's important is that it becomes the toolkit that the council and the city has to actually make all these things happen. That's the same thing you said.
You like that?
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
And, and I guess in terms of, one thing that I really, one thing I like about this, and I think this goes to what Councilor Carlone was saying, is that, we're a small city. And so what happens in one neighborhood really does impact what happens in another neighborhood. And it's never quite made sense to me that we will, if we're doing something in Kendall, we'll look at how the traffic will impact Kendall, but we don't necessarily look at how it will impact Central when that's right next door, And so having that's, to me, that's going to be the greatest advantage of this, is really looking at how all of this stuff ties together, because we're all on top of each other, and it is such a small city.
Just one other point relative to that is that this is a plan that's going to be done in a data-rich environment that wasn't true even 5-10 years ago. And so the other legacy of our plan is better managed, available data that can be mined and used for other decisions moving forward too. So we're going to be a little bit the city's data managers, which will have value for those kinds of questions.
So we've talked to you about the fact that we are doing STAR communities in parallel to this, which is a way to look at information and data, both qualitative and quantitative, to see how we're doing as a city. And our expectation is that when we go through this process, we might in fact add to what our national guidelines that come from STAR. We may come up with things that are really Cambridge-centric that we might want to measure ourselves again and keep measuring as we go along, and it'll give us a method to know how successful we are over time in terms of our goals that we establish.
In terms of indicators, yeah.
So I agree with Councilor Toomey in the respect that, for example, around affordable housing, that I'd like to see affordable housing in other parts of the city as opposed to just concentrated in certain areas. But where I sort of differ is, there are some places where you can have density, and there are some places where it doesn't make as much sense. And sort of the example I use is up on a project, 2 projects up in Walden Street, Richdale Ave area, on Richdale Ave, where there was a developer that wanted to go higher than what was allowed, and then most recently the Massey's site that's been discussed. Both of those projects, I made it very clear to the developer that I didn't think I would not support going higher or more dense in those places. But yet the project on Mass Ave across the street from Porter Square, where the old White Hen Pantry used to be, is a place where I would have been more willing to look at something higher, because it's on a main street, it's not in the middle of a neighborhood, it's across the street from the T. So, so I think, you can't have density everywhere, right? But there are places where you can have it. But certainly you can have affordable housing or in different levels and different scales throughout the city. And I guess lastly, on the community input piece, and I've said this all along, I mean, I think one of the things I liked about you guys, I think the outreach, I think it's going to have to be really door-to-door outreach in a lot of places and a lot of communities. I think it's going to be connecting with people in those communities that are respected and trusted, to be there with you and to talk to people. This will not be a citywide plan if all the people who are giving input to this plan look like me. God help us. And so we're going to have to, I know, well, thanks, Craig. But it's really going to take, it's really going to take a concerted effort and a real targeted effort, and it goes beyond sort of food and childcare. That stuff is always good, and that stuff's always helpful, but it's really going to be, how do you connect with people in communities that haven't felt part of the process for one reason or another, who may feel that their opinions aren't going to be as respected as other folks in the community, and that's going to be key for me in terms of figuring out, is this really a citywide plan that takes into account the diverse voices of the city, or is this just being, one particular demographic or two that are driving the whole thing? And so I look forward to how you're going to roll that out.
I mean, I'm hoping we have a little bit of a conversation about that tonight before we have to wrap up, because we have some ideas about how to do that. And maybe after this round of Q&A, I could share some of those, but then to get advice from all of you about which people to talk to. And we want to talk to people first to get advice about how to do it before we start actually doing it. You know what I mean? Like, it's a little bit meta, I know, but I think probably the counselors, as much as anybody else in the city, knows which communities are underrepresented in these discussions, which people to talk to devise a plan to get those people engaged. I think one plan is to go meet with groups on their home turf rather than always have them come here. And to really go on a listening tour, both about how to do it as well as what their issues are. So maybe we can have a conversation about that in a few minutes.
Sorry, just the one other thing I wanted to add related to that is that UTIL suggested to us what we thought was a very good idea, is to have, in addition to our typical advisory committee, to have a working group or a subcommittee that's really focused on outreach and on advising us about outreach. And so those could be the people who are real connectors in the community and are allowing us to reach different groups. So that may include some community elders. It may include, people from the faith community. It may include folks from the tenant association. So ways to really, for them to then be, create this fractal effect and be able to reach out to larger groups, which we thought was a very
even to say these people are okay, you should talk to them, like even at that level. So we'll be, I suppose, reaching out to all of you too about who might be on that group and who those connectors are. That's kind of a term, a current term, no? So.
Nadine.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, I actually wanted the bulk of my comments to be on this topic, so maybe that will be a useful segue from the Q&A to the community outreach. I was excited to see a street team amongst other kind of comprehensive outreach plans. I think for something like a street team to be successful, it'd need to be extremely well either capitalized or resourced in order to be consistent. And I think consistency is the main part of outreach that could make it a successful effort. I very much appreciate the comments of Councilor McGovern and Councilor Carlone. What I would suggest is that, especially amongst our immigrant communities, I learned recently that the Bangla community has like a 40-year strong organizing effort that's never really once overlapped civic and city participation at all, whether here or in Medford, where they also have some presence, or in some of the other bordering towns. I bet you that, in fact, I know that there's a lot of organizations like that for other immigrant groups, and these are precisely the groups that feel disenfranchised when it comes to city planning and city affairs in general. I think consistency is a main factor. Outreach in many languages is important, but in many cases, the leaders of these organizations are highly fluent and highly professionally adept in English and in our local economy and small business in general, it's really that we're not hitting these leaders frequently enough. We bounce off them and say hi, and then we don't engage them with any frequency. We need real relationships through that consistency, but we also need champions. And I think I appreciated that Iram said that we may want to reach out to elders or connectors, but often elders are standing in place of the disengaged and are not actually representing the disengaged. At least that's often true in my community, in my diaspora. And I think there's a lot of ways to engage different facets of our immigrant community rather than treating it as a monolith or treating it as having de facto representatives, myself or anyone else. So whether elected, appointed, or anything else, I think it's really important that we get a real good feel for large chunks of this city that have been disenfranchised for a long time. And lastly, I'll say that it's important to wind up this effort, but it really should, in my opinion, feel like winding something new up. We don't have these networks, we don't have these communication patterns, we don't have these practices. The CET exists and they do a great job, but there's no way that they could ever have the wherewithal or the resources to try to cover the consistent engagement with the breadth and depth that we're talking about here. And so some of the extra resources we're talking about allocating to CDD really, in my opinion, ought to be either consistently applied in terms of outreach or at least, or maybe even considered for some kind of permanent presence in our outreach and civic engagement efforts. And
Even beyond this plan.
Even beyond this plan. And I'll say lastly that Vice Mayor Benson and I spent a large part of this term working on out-of-school time coordination and the need for outreach as part of that coordination. We just saw incredible, and you can back me up or differ as you like, but I think we saw incredible alignment amongst stakeholders in terms of the lack of go-betweens. How does the corporate ecosystem actually interface with the school system? How do schools actually reach out to low socioeconomic status and families and all families? The connective tissue has been strained, and in some cases has been intrinsically weak. And I think we not only need to spin this up, but have a lot of repair to do in our civic outreach and actualization efforts. You're welcome to reflect on that if you'd like.
A question about that, because we find the best way to wind it up or get the process going is to go to people that can advise us and get advice about how to do this, because you're getting a certain level of, I mean, first of all, it's a sincere question. We don't know. We travel from across the river, right? So we need, even as cultural anthropologists in Cambridge, need to understand the many ecosystems here, how they operate both as a business community, as a social community, as a cultural community, how they interact both with the city and each other, and that's going to help us figure out how to map this out. I think that early listening tour is going to enrich the plan. It's going to enrich our process, and it's going to make our plan unique and not a kind of cookie-cutter plan, because we are professionals and we have a certain, toolkit that we use, and we have a certain lens that we look at things, but we enjoy planning processes the most when we discover wonderful, unique, unexpected things, So it's also for the benefit of even what we do in land use policy, that this richer dialogue happens pretty early on. So we're excited about it. And back to what Iram mentioned, to maybe have a ad hoc committee or a small committee that might involve some of you, might involve other people that are recommended to help us get to the thought leaders in each of these communities. People that, as you said, I like to say people that understand how the world works too, but that's always important, would be very helpful early on. Yeah.
So to answer the question part of that bit, yes, I think reaching out to people and asking them how best to proceed is probably the greatest and most open-endedly positive way that you could approach figuring out how to do your outreach. I would say that my gut tells me that outreach of this nature, if you want to find those thought leaders, and especially if you want to find the unexpected ones who aren't the ready known names in each community but have a lot to offer, that it's just like a traditional sales funnel. You know when you're selling that you've got all these leads and you want the warm leads and the fewer ready to be converted leads, and then you have your conversions. It's the same thing here, and often when we reach communities, we don't think of, did we actually convert people who are not just receiving our entree or receiving our interview and participating, but are they actually proactively reaching back out and becoming part of the city's civic processes? Are they actually reaching back out proactively and helping us organize so that we don't have to consistently expend these efforts, and they're there for us, and they're creating this fabric? Getting to that endpoint is hard, and there's barriers at each tranche. But I don't necessarily know how you'll get there in each community, but I just want us to know that we'll know when we've hit it, and that we haven't hit it yet for most of the city's communities.
Rich and then Craig.
I just wanted to add a little bit, as I'm sitting here thinking that there's no way we'll spend $6 million, not to offend Councilor Toomey in any way. I'm saying, how can I assure that we're not going to spend $6 million? And one thing, by the nature of the enthusiasm of this conversation and the consultant, I think it's important to note that one way where we could head down a path that would be difficult would be if everybody just decides they can contact the consultant and ask for this and ask for that and ask them to come to meetings. And when I say everyone, I'm talking primarily about city staff and council. And I think the only way we're going to control that effectively is that those communications need to go through Aram and Melissa at community development. They would then be engaging with the consultant. I think if we do that, it doesn't mean we can't get different information or try new things. It just means that way we'll be in control of the budget and be able to manage it effectively. That also puts a burden too, I think, on the consultant. If you want to be totally open and friendly, that's great. The only problem might be you might then get yourself down a path where you're into doing a lot of different reports and all that. Not saying that we're not going to do these things. I am not saying we're not going to change the course, but I do think we need to be mindful of how to properly monitor all that so it does happen the right way.
Mr. Mayor, just not to offend the city manager, but he didn't say we wouldn't spend more than $3,301,000 either. He said,
Let me say this, we won't spend a dime more of that without coming back to the city council for an authorization. How about that? 50-50, I'd say, words.
goes to my point, it's going to be above.
If it's above, it's above. If it's a $5 million project, it's a $5 million project. I view this plan as being transformational for the city. Anything less than that, I view as a failure. We cannot look back to what we did in the past and think this is going to work. We had this amazing opportunity to build the Cambridge of the future, and I want this plan to help us get whatever it is we need, the political courage, the data, the conversational skills, the community input, whatever it is we need to build that city, and I'm really, really, really excited about it. I'm also terrified of what we're going to learn when we finally get the, no offense to anyone, long-delayed climate vulnerability assessment. I think that is going to pose challenges for us that are just going to be incredibly daunting and are going to make this project even more expensive. So let's not focus on the $3.whatever million. Let's focus on giving us something that builds the best possible Cambridge we can get. And I agree with the manager, we need to go through proper channels to have our input gotten back and forth, and if I step out of line, I hope I get slapped appropriately. So I'm excited about this, and thank you.
Dennis B.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to Iram and other city staff, I want to thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of different questions in different areas. I'm first just going to start by going back to one of these charts here, where we are looking at the types of jobs that we once had in our city, construction, manufacturing employers. We look we see that there's been a decrease in that, significant decrease, and an increase in technology, software, and R&D employers, as well as biotech employers. You know, when we talk about development in our city, we tend to talk about structures. And I've said this before, that we don't really talk about how do we develop people. And I think in the end, we want a city where people can work, live, and play. The play part, we're beginning to get that right. The live part, we're beginning to get that somewhat right. One of the biggest challenges is that commercial development has not been in sync with housing development, and that's something that I hope to learn from this study. And so I wanted you to just briefly address that issue, that commercial development has not been in sync with housing development, and what challenges that poses for our city.
Yeah, I think there's two related answers. One is that we plan to look at job sectors specifically as part of this plan, to provide some economic development guidance for the city around potential job sectors that might be able to leverage off of life science and tech, but create other kinds of jobs. I don't know what those are yet. We haven't done the plan yet, but we have 2 consultants on our team that are going to help us think about that, not just the physical implications of that understanding, but even some policy starters for the city itself in terms of maybe the kinds of companies it markets for, or the way that it might do outreach to life science companies about the advantages of having, as part of their supply chain of knowledge, those kinds of companies they rely on maybe closer to their headquarters buildings, let's say. But a commercial development issue is another point. It has to do with the cycles of development. Housing development tends to have an on cycle more often than commercial development does, because vacancy rates are a more fluid commodity across the region. But it also has to do with policy decisions that a city makes. Somerville is making a decision with the Union Square plan to require a percentage of commercial real estate as part of the Union Square build-out, the US 2 developer. Even though the market isn't there, as part of the requirement of giving them the go-ahead. So in some cases, it requires a decision that runs against the market, that might drive, the market attraction of a certain area as well. So often land policy needs to make decisions that bends the market in certain directions instead of just enabling it. And I think in one case it might be the commercial residential balance. So I don't know if those 2 answers got at some of the points that you were making.
So a lot has been said about the traffic that has been the result of much of the development that we've seen in the city, whether it's housing and commercial development. And I'm looking at one of the charts here, and if I'm not reading this incorrectly, means of transportation to work in 2014, motor vehicle 32%, in 2000 it was 42%, so we've actually seen a decrease in the use of motor vehicles. More people are walking, more people are taking the subway, more people are biking. So with respect to biking, I know that we've had a lot of conversations about a bike network plan and building more bike facilities that resemble a lot of the bike facilities that we would see in Europe. So what is the bike network plan? How would that be rolled into this master plan? Because we had a hearing a couple of days ago, and I know that we are somewhat eager to adopt that plan. And I'm not sure if that would be a mistake, if it's something that we would be doing prematurely without really thinking a little bit more about how it would work with other transportation modes in our city, and the whole idea of complete streets, and whether or not that's a good idea to have complete streets, or we should abandon that plan and move to a different type of plan. I know that there's also a chart in here that talks about different modes of transportation on streets. I mean, I know that as part of complete streets, we sometimes try to accommodate too many modes of transportation, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And so, some of these discussions will need to happen sooner than later. So, for example, in Area 4, we're going to be spending $35 million in infrastructure improvements. And, I've been a strong proponent of focusing this plan on the Alewife area. But in cases like Area 4, where we're going to be spending this money, would it make sense to begin looking at neighborhood streets and some of the other ideas that have come forward as a result of our trip to Amsterdam? And we're not going to get into that right now, but
Well, a couple of answers. One is that I believe in what I call live TV planning, where you still need to be making decisions as a city, even as we're planning. But certainly, the priorities as they're coming up are like a gravitational field on what priorities we look at as the plan moves along. And so there's already a wealth of traffic data in Cambridge. The bicycle accommodation plan is on the table. I think a lot of cities across the country, because bike accommodation usually involves, repainting streets and trying it, is I think in some cases the bike plan, incorporating some of it doesn't require a full working out of the plan. On the other hand, we'd be happy to target specific areas and do a quick, gut test on areas as well. So I know that's, I know the issue of bikes versus traffic is an emotional issue everywhere, and in Cambridge too. I think that implementing bicycle accommodation tends to also drive an acceleration in mode shift too, because once it's easier to take a bicycle, the mode shift also shifts, and that's good for the traffic patterns. That's playing itself out, by the way, in Kendall Square as we speak. So certainly we could do a data analysis relatively early on if that's an early action item by the city.
I just wanted to add one thing, that as Tim was talking about this notion of potentially testing out some of the ideas, it made me think about your two questions together, because these are opportunities when you think about how is this a plan for people. I think as much as there are opportunities to test out ideas, there are also opportunities to get people not just engaged in conversation, but in doing, and maybe get kids interested in things like planning or thinking about the city and understanding various topics. We've talked about, we talked earlier about elders, but we've talked a lot about how do we engage kids. And the Boston Society of Architects has a BSA foundation that does incredible work with kids focusing on architecture and urban planning. And we think that groups like that would be good to involve here. Council has often asked us about how would you work with street teams, and how would you work with local universities. And I think this plan will be an opportunity to kind of curate some of those ideas and pull in some of those opportunities, and as a way to create not just a program for youth or a program for older folks, but also to have that intergenerational conversation and engagement and learning. So I think that I don't want to oversell the plan, but I think the plan itself can also be an opportunity for community building and for people to find interests and paths that they may not have otherwise found.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to Assistant City Manager Iran Farouk. And I appreciate that, Iran, in many ways. As you know, this summer I had a group of my interns testify before the planning board, and they talked about the Volpe site. And, what's interesting with young people that are exposed to development is that what their concerns don't necessarily look like the concerns of many of the people that are in this room. Their concerns, when they see development, they think about opportunity. And what's great about Cambridge is that we have a history of a city that provided opportunity for people to work in factories, and those factories have now been replaced by the innovation economy. And so our greatest challenge is not so much determining the height of a building, but it's really how do we get our communities into those buildings so that they can live, work, and play in Cambridge. And I think that when we think about development, that's what we have to be thinking about, because many of us have the privilege of owning our homes. And, it's clear from one of the maps, the graphs that you've demonstrated here, that that the highest percentage of people that rent housing is in my neighborhood. And the highest percentage of people that own homes is in, neighborhoods across the city. But those are the people that are most concerned about development. And the people that are really feeling the economic forces of development are the people that are renting and are competing for housing with millennials that are going into our neighborhoods and are able to have 4 or 5 students in a room, or young professionals in an apartment, and are able to pay $3,000, $4,000 a month rent. So, I think that really the greatest development challenge, and I hope that this master plan, with all this money that we're spending, really engages our young people. And I see Assistant City Manager Ellen Semenoff, if we can think about a way to engage the mayor's program and our high school students, but also when we think about engaging the community, it's not so much just going to the leaders of that community, it's offering an incentive, and that incentive could be a small stipend, which is what I provided my young students this summer. And that will get them interested in it, and once they learn it, they're going to love it because they have an opportunity to shape an area. Which takes me to the next question, which is, the Volpe site is in question right now, and I'm just wondering, how that development would be impacted by this master plan, as well as the MXT district, which has come before us. I think that the master plan can have a major impact on the city, particularly around transportation mobility. I think that's something that the master plan can certainly address. The development issues are going to be a little harder because we don't have that much land left. And we've pretty much determined that Alewife is a priority because there's land there. There's a little bit of land in Kendall Square, and there's some land in North Point, but we're not going to be developing in every neighborhood in the city. Some of the neighbors are already established. There are a lot of wood frame homes, and I think that's just a reality. So, I think we, as a city, have a responsibility to let people know in our neighborhoods that, first of all, the development is not necessarily a bad thing. It's opportunity, and we have an opportunity to shape it. And this is going to help us shape that, but to think that this is going to solve concerns around development and that have significant benefits to our city in terms of low taxes, right? And I think you talked a little bit about that financial piece. That I feel that many of our residents don't really fully understand how beneficial development could be, right? And that's a message that we need to get out as part of this plan. For example, it's said that high-end commercial development makes our city less affordable, right? Well, for someone that is house rich and cash poor, that's not true, right? Because commercial development, 65% of our taxes, come from that. That keeps our residential taxes low.
Right.
Okay. And that's something that's not really being heard out there. And when I will know that we reached the right point in our city's history when I see large numbers of people from our neighborhoods going into the workforce. And so I'm really looking forward to these conversations and really engaging our community. And I had one more question here. Just bear with me. It was about Volpe. So where do you see the Volpe development falling into this master planning process, given that the time is of the essence with that particular project?
Probably better if you. Yeah, it was part of the Kendall Central Plan, and I know that there's still a process going on to refine the master plan for Volpe before there's a disposition process and a developer is selected. We're happy to serve any way the city staff would like us to. But I think that one of the immediate benefits is, as we're looking at and mining data across the entire city, that we can provide a larger context for some of the impacts relative to a larger data set. because we're also looking forward to learning about and educating the public about all the things that you raise, all the benefits of development too, because development can be a problem if it's very close to your house or it impacts an established residential neighborhood. But in terms of jobs, the tax base, paying for affordable housing and infrastructure, there are lots of benefits too. But but what's nice about this plan is because there are such limited areas where growth is still possible. At a higher level of detail, we can actually model choices, as Councilor Carlone said, and provide a detailed look at choices about what that means relative to the benefits that you're talking about. And I think that for the Volpe project in particular, those data sets are already there given the master plan. We can feed that into the citywide plan we're doing as one of the scenarios, to generate that aggregate data, if that makes sense.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
An opportunity to weigh in, and then we have some follow-up questions from some of the council.
Thank you. I'm Hugh Russell. So I've been listening to this. This is all on a very high conceptual level, and I'm much more kind of practically oriented. So I'm just going to talk about a few things that I'm hoping that this process will teach me about. Of course, I'm very interested in the OI study and the land that's underused in the quadrangle in particular. And I'm also interested in Route 2 going west outside the city, or really more, going west is fine, it's the coming east that creates the problems for the city. Can we, in our transportation plan, develop strategies that might reduce the number of cars that are coming in Route 2, to develop a case for, say, extension of bus rapid transit out west, stuff like that? There hasn't been a lot of talk about our neighborhoods, although various councilors have mentioned that the 3-story wood frame neighborhoods that most of us live in fact, the majority of the city lives in these neighborhoods. And we tend in some ways to think of them as sort of fixed. But if you actually live in one of those houses, you find that your needs change. I think it's unconscionable that it takes you 6 months to get approval to put a window in your house if it's on the wrong side. But it might make all the difference. The energy plan is going to show that there's a lot of energy opportunity in our 3-story wood frame buildings. But how do we tap into that? How do we get people able to do that? What does that mean in terms of the regulatory process or the incentive process? To me, that's important. Sometimes your family needs more space, sometimes it needs less space. There's a proposal before us all on that issue. I'm tempted to say, let's kick it into the master plan process because it's complicated and really we should get more data on what's needed. So the Kennedy School just came for approval of their last phase of construction. And I think we all recognize the Kennedy School is an incredible asset for the entire world in terms of looking at how we govern ourselves as human beings. But what's going to happen 10 years from now when they're busting at the seams again? Should there be a strategy for that? There are other very valuable institutions in the city that nonprofits, there are churches, there are other universities, there's Lesley, there's Cambridge College. How do they get integrated? Because they're part of us, but yet they're also part of what we give to the rest of the world. We spent a lot of time looking at MIT because they've got those 6 parking lots that they want to develop. We haven't looked much at Harvard. We're basically saying, oh yeah, whatever it is you're going to do it in Alston. And maybe that's what it is, but maybe that's not the best thing for us or the best thing for that institution. Maybe those kids who are marooned out in the Radcliffe Quad could be brought in closer to the core, for example. And maybe some grad students could be out there. Grad student housing is a big issue because it drives people out of their homes in the residential neighborhoods. Retail. I guess you've all noticed you buy more things on the internet. And retail's changing. Retail's constantly changing. Where is it going to be in 10 or 20 years? Is all the retail space in the city going to be restaurants? Now, where do we get the stuff? Are we all going to get it on the internet? How does that major force that's happening in commerce going to affect us? Bike network, I'm very interested in the bike network, of course. Now, I don't ride Mass Avenue from Holyoke Street to Hancock Street because that marked bike lane has got the worst pavement of any bike lane that I know. There's awful potholes, there's grates, there's things. I dream of this magic machine that's the width of a bike lane that can somehow go across that and smooth it all out and make it nice. I mean, that actually happened through the underpass. You used to go eastbound through the underpass. You took your life in your hands because there were a whole bunch of potholes. So you get up a nice set of speed, you're doing 25 miles an hour, and then you got to dodge around the potholes, and if there's some ice or snow. So I didn't do that. Well, now it's super. It's all smooth. The bike lane's wider. The cars are only 2 lanes. You feel a little bit less threatened. But how do you know you can draw lines on a map, but somehow if you're a bicyclist, that interface is very important. And I have a response to the question about the Volpe site. I hope you will adopt Volpe rezoning in the next few months so that the process can go forward so that we can get the housing we need and the open space we need, and Volpe can get the new facility they need. But if you pass that zoning, nothing's going to happen for 3 years. It's going to take that whole GSA process 3 years to get started. And then we're going to eventually get people coming, presenting us buildings. First, they're going to present a master plan at the planning board. And if we know more about the connections and the open space, which we will, we can use that in administering the plan. As a building comes to us, we're going to say, well, we know more about retail. We know more about what we exactly want to do. So we can take the benefits of this study and apply it to the build-out. We may not, we probably won't change the heights and the floor area, although we might know more about where certain heights are better. So I think this process can help us, because as I think Yoram said a while ago, these studies don't stay on the shelf. They get enacted in zoning, and the zoning gets to us. Now, the planning board was under a lot of pressure about a year ago over Alewife. And we were administering the enacted policy in Alewife. And I think we've now all come to realize that needs a very quick updating and look, that things were happening there that nobody really anticipated. So, but I've been working on planning in Harvard Square for 35 years. And there was a major rezoning in 1986. And that template has been followed, and it's been rather slow. But every year, there's 1 or 2 buildings built in Harvard Square, and it's gradually coming to look almost exactly like the zoning said it could happen. So, this is an important process. If you follow up with the zoning and the other city policies, our city will gradually grow in those directions we want it to grow.
Thank you. Thank you. Lou, would you like to?
Very little. I have very little. One of the things I'm concerned with as we go through this whole process, the day after it's adopted, someone comes with a zoning amendment. Gone. That someone comes with a zoning amendment and here we are off and running again. How do you put enough teeth in it to make it stable?
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to add a couple of comments, and then I'm going to go, and I have a queue of people that want to go back and ask some more questions. But, I just want to say, Hugh, that I think that your comments are very insightful. Some of the issues that I would say that I think that we struggle with as a community is that we have a lot of older folks who are in homes that are somewhat overhoused, and we have a lot of young people who are in homes who are underhoused. And how can we be nimble enough and flexible enough to allow a growing family to stay in Cambridge? And I will say, the comment you made about the window taking 6 months, we can look at basements, we can look at how someone can add a bathroom or a dormer to their house. Depending upon who the neighbor is, they can or cannot do that. And I think that we have to be able to look at that and have a better way of responding to it. It shouldn't be because you live next door to Donna and I live next door to Dennis that I can't get it and she can get it. And I think that that's exactly the way it works right now, that depending upon where a person lives and who their neighbor is, you will see structures in the city and you'll say, well, geez, I could do that to my house, but then you can't do it because someone is objecting and threatening you with court action and legal costs. I think we look at this and say, how long are people living today? And people are living much longer lives than they lived in the 1950s and the 1960s. And there is a need. There are many, many, countless people that I know in this community that have elderly parents that they want to bring in. They should be able to have small apartments in their homes for them. Zoning doesn't allow it in many cases. So I think that when I think about this master plan, it's about the big tracts of land, which there aren't a lot of, but it's also about how we as a community can be more nimble in thinking about how we can respond to residents. And I think a lot of that is in those wood frame small homes and the ability for us to be able to take the way people live in the 21st century was much different than it was in the 19th century when many of these wood frame homes were built. And, I'm not against, I'm not promoting getting rid of any architectural detail in these homes. We don't want to do that. But I think we want to be able to allow people flexibility is what is the word that I would use.
That's a new topic that's come up, the fine grain. The regulatory category for that is accessory dwelling units, whether it's in a basement or it's a converted carriage house. And I think that we can provide, with this process, the data about what the impacts would be with different models of rezoning in terms of number of units it would yield, and what the impacts would be on in-law units, units for grad students, and at least have a discussion around the facts about that.
And I will say that I think, another piece of the discussion that I think if we look at who the largest property owners are in the city, they are Harvard University and they're MIT. And I think we have to figure out a way that we can have a conversation with Harvard and MIT about the transfer of development rights, about allowing them to build denser on their campus, and in exchange, perhaps the city comes up with money to be able to build low and moderate income housing on, they're the ones that have the land. We don't have the land. And I think we have to think very cleverly how we can do this. And, you know, there were many instances where, both on the Harvard campus and at MIT, MIT has more land, if you look at it, or undeveloped or underdeveloped land than Harvard does. But Harvard does have parking lots. Harvard has some older buildings, some of them bordering residential neighborhoods that we could look at that probably are not the most desirable land to their campus. And so I think we need to think about that. And I think that, I had a bunch of things here, but many of the comments have been made, but I look forward to this discussion. I think it is an opportunity. I don't want to see things just stop and wait for 3 years, and I don't think that's what we're doing. I also want to just go back to one point that was made at the very beginning, that I think we have to respect those who have put in a lot of time into a lot of planning processes before. Because I think that, quite honestly, there is a little bit of a feeling in the community that people put in time, they put in their hard work, and we don't respond. And I'm saying we as a, whether it's a city council or whether it's as a community. And so I think there is a little bit of cynicism about going forward with another planning process. And then it is who rises up at the end of that planning process to say, well, we weren't involved, and so we need to start it all over again. And that is the part about kind of reaching out and making sure we are involving people. And it's not necessarily, I don't look at this as involving, you're not going to involve everybody in the community. But I think educating people, keeping people informed about what's going on, I think that's kind of a goal that I would have. And I would say, I think we do need to hear, and I'll just tell you that I spoke with a group of young Cambridge residents the other day, mainly in their 20s and 30s. And, you know, these were all professionals, but they were not professionals making $200,000 a year. They were probably, professionals making $80,000 or $85,000, and they're feeling squeezed. And I think that's, you know, so even as a couple making $150,000, they're looking at it saying, where do we go? How do we buy property here? And a lot of those people are making determinations to go elsewhere, where we would like to be able to keep them in the city. It provides stability in our school systems. It provides stability, and it provides continuity in our neighborhoods to be able to keep folks here. And so I hope when we reach out that we really are getting a cross-section of the city to weigh in on this and all of the types of issues that folks are facing. But thank you. I have Craig, I have Nadeem, I have Mark, and I have Dennis.
Thanks. I would just reiterate that I want this plan to be transformational. So when Harvard Kennedy School, which I love and went to, comes and says, we want to be bigger, we say to them, transform how you teach, and you can teach on weekends and use that same space differently. And if we're still having the discussion about bike lanes and bikes versus cars, when this plan is done, I will be so frustrated. There's way more about urban transportation than that. The future of the electric vehicle, the future of the personal assisted vehicle, all this stuff is out there. So let's not get stuck on cars versus bikes, because that discussion will not get us to the transportation future that we need. I am really excited. I don't know if you've noticed, but I'm really excited about this whole process, and I think we can do great things. Let's not get stuck in the past or on a $3.3 million budget.
Okay, Nadeem.
Thank you. I think Hugh Russell's comment about, what are we going to do when it's 10 years on and we're bursting at the seams again is really apropos. And actually, a lot of the decisions I make and a lot of the consideration that I bring is from the context where it seems like we're operating in some kind of futile near-term bubble. where even if we do all the right things right on step, on course, we'll actually be in the same problem again in 10 years. And I don't mind doing that as long as we also have our eye on the long-term future and on the solutions that we want to face for density, congestion, equity, economic development, economic mobility, with a view to how the problem is actually getting worse even when we do our best. And that's the best by way of someone else's ideology or the best by way of mine. It's just two competing versions of a pretty unpalatable outcome, and we're just negotiating for who will be slightly better or slightly worse. And the fact is that the market's operating against us, that the layout of the city and that the age of the infrastructure is operating against us. And I don't want to say it's the end of the world here. It's not the easiest place to create equitable solutions, and when we don't look at the 10 to 20 year time period, it's really problematic. Also, to his comment on ground floor retail, I share the same feeling that we're not going to have commodity businesses in our ground floor retail. We're going to have a lot of hyper-local services, and we're going to have a lot of distributed opportunities for gathering, for leisure, for food. Ideally, we'd also have a lot of distributed opportunities for like manufacturing, hands-on learning, decentralized production, design. I feel like I'm sitting on one in the shop that I operate, but I actually think that that's an important thing for the city to look towards well after I'm in office, as a way to engage people in learning and in meaningful production and economic mobility at the same time.
But even reimagine use categories.
Yes, reimagine use categories is what he said. And then lastly, to Mayor Marr's point, that I think our university campuses actually do have a really large role to play, given some of the development opportunities. It's the two places where the neighborhood, when done within the bounds of these campuses, the neighborhood will have the least objections to density, and it's the greatest opportunity we have for helping them house graduate students who may be spilling in and creating pressure in our housing market, and or creating mixed income, mixed use, mixed culture opportunities for housing that actually engages our population's need on their plot. So I think we're of like mind there, and it would be really exciting to see those two things tackled head on. Thank you.
Mark.
Thank you. I think the key to this, I'm sure that when this is done, there are going to be things that I like, things that I don't like, things I agree with, things that I don't. I think the key really is process, because I think what tends to happen, and this goes to the mayor's point, is that we go through a study, we ask people to be involved, there's a process, and then if the results aren't what some people like, then it's the process that gets questioned. And sometimes we're not always so good at being able to show that the process really was a good process. Sometimes we botch it, right? So, if we're going to be able to go back and say, I understand that you're not happy with this result, or folks who say, why am I just hearing about this now, even though it's been going on for 3 years? We have to be able to show very clearly what the process was and what we did, because that sinks more studies than anything else, is that if the study comes out a certain way and it's not the way somebody wants it or a group wants it one way or the other, that it says, well, the process was bad, it was this, it was that, it was this, and then it gets kind of put away. And I think that's what we saw with C2. So, I do think it's very, very important that I think the communication, Mr. Manager, from you to the council and the communication to the public, the updates need to be extremely regular. Because I'm thinking about the community conversations piece, right? We started this, it got silent for a while, we really weren't explaining to people what was going on, and sort of in the absence of information, rumors start to happen that's it, the master plan isn't really happening, they're not really doing it, even though there was work going on. And that's on us to make sure that we're communicating what's happening. And so, when we did when I was on school committee and we did the innovation agenda, which was a restructuring of the schools, we only met twice a month, at every meeting, it was on the agenda for some sort of update. And sometimes the update was, not much is different than 2 weeks ago, and that's it. And I'm not saying it should be on every week, but and I'm not expecting a big report, but I think, if once a month there's some kind of feedback that says, this is what we're doing, people will know that it's happening, and it'll help keep the word out there. And I don't want to see silence for 3 or 4 months, and then people start to wonder what's going on, and then it becomes this, fodder for misinformation to be put out there. So I think the process is going to be key. We need to be able to, when this is all said and done, regardless of the outcome, show that this was a fair, open, transparent process where the input was taken into account, where we did a lot of, did significant outreach, because that is what sinks more of these studies than anything else.
I have a few comments based on the conversation that we've had since my last round of questions and comments, but I hope we can go over Aram's memorandum, not to change things dramatically, but to ask for some clarification on a few points. First of all, I'd love to say Lou's comment about what's the best way to get zoning. It's clearly understood that by designing through urban design what you want, you then do the zoning to get that urban design built. And I just participated with Councilor Chung and Councilor McGovern, among others, on Massey Hardware, where we actually increased the FAR to make it work financially. Not much, but we did. But the design in the end fits into the neighborhood, whereas the original design was a horror show, and the zoning allowed it. So it's through design, it's through urban design that you test what the zoning is, and you go back and forth and you modify the urban design. So you have to represent visually what is being recommended. If it's only in words, we all interpret words differently. And a picture conveys the spirit much, much more. And I would say that has been the weakness in many of the studies in the past. They didn't go to that stage and then do the zoning based on what was the preferred urban design. And I hope very much that that will be the case here. We're already the 8th densest city. And studies, granted mostly in England and Canada, indicate that 50 residents an acre is sort of what they've referred to as the sweet spot. We're not there yet in Cambridge, but how big do we want to be? To me, this is the biggest question in the master plan. How big can we be? How big do we want to be? How big should certain areas of the city be? And it won't be all the same. It will be varied, I get that. But the other thing is, it's come up, every master plan should evolve over time. What UTIL is going to put together with the city will be of that moment, but as was alluded to earlier by Councilor McGovern, things will change, and hopefully there will be yearly updates on the portion that changes. It won't be major changes, but it will change. And it seems to me, Hugh Russell on the planning board mentioned Harvard Square and Volpe. Harvard Square is, the framework is there. Yes, one-story buildings are going to go in the future, but it builds incrementally over time, just like it evolved. Volpe's going to be instant city. It's a vacant site in essence, because even the existing Volpe buildings will be gone. So if it's going to be the most dense part of the city, and it's at the heart of Kendall Square, abutting 2 historic neighborhoods, one would assume that the city would come forth with the ideal public view of what the plan should be, and not just leave it again to words that were not studied through an urban design study that showed the ideal. And I think that's night and day with Harvard Square. completely night and day. And that, to me, is the biggest scare I have about that. In Harvard Square, there's enormous oversight. Too much, perhaps, I grant you that, but enormous. We have to, as a city, say, this is what we expect at Volpe, and then see which developer comes the closest. Every developer is going to meet the financial requirements, or their proposal is going to be thrown out. We should be at the table to decide which is then best from a city point of view. And that's going to be a big issue with GSA, I get that. So I'm happy to wait on this if other councilors or board members, planning board members have comments, but there are a few questions such as regular updates. Is that regular once every 6 months, ideally every 3 months? And I realize it's going to change depending on the production of work, but regular updates struck me as very vague, and the review, I can keep going if you want, but well, maybe we'll stay there. What does regular updates really mean? At key points that UT will decide and the city will decide to present issues, or it's not every week, as Council McGovern rightfully said, is too much, but it's nice to be in the loop. And I realize that the council can't be directly involved, but we sure do want to make sure the overall policy follows suit.
Councilor, I'll say we haven't quite pinned down what the regular would be. It could be quarterly, but an alternative format might be what Councilor McGovern was talking about, so that staff could provide an update on a very regular basis, so maybe like a monthly update to you, and then at key points where there's something significant that UTIL needs to come and provide more information on, then they can come in, so that there is a regular information, and then we can have greater
That
engagement.
sounds great, and maybe even every month is not, that's too much from your perspective, but all I'm asking for is, just as you've thought the schedule out, please.
Sorry, the city manager reminds me that we will have a website, so there will obviously be ongoing information that's going to be archived there, that will be available on an ongoing basis.
A dialogue is what I'm getting at, and feeling like we're somehow in the loop. And I'm not even suggesting a month is correct. Maybe it's 2 months, but just think about that. And when the few key presentations that would exist, so that we have a sense of it. On the advisory committee, I don't know how you're going to do that and feel you've represented key people. I immediately think of Local First, the small locally owned retail folks should be on this. To me, that's a key, that almost every resident wants to maintain the locally owned retail, the unique retail. And as was suggested earlier with the internet, it's very possible that could be the main retail that survives because of the unique things they bring. So how that's going to be decided, to me, is absolutely crucial in your success.
So the way we've envisioned this, and this is still very much in flux, but a recent model that was incredibly successful was the model that we utilized for the net zero process. So there we had a small committee that was that had some representation from the key sectors as well as technical experts, and then we had an array of working groups or subcommittees that were more topic-focused. So an entity like Local First may not need to be in the overarching advisory committee, but would be absolutely crucial to have in a group that was talking about retail or the ground floor environment. So we're still trying to think about what this, once we officially have UTIL on board, we'll really start to lay out what are the, what might be the working groups that we would need to have, and then who needs to be in them. But we absolutely want to make sure that there is a system that is manageable, so that we don't have a 50% committee that we can never, people only get to say.
But you know what I'm saying. This is where some people feel there was a flaw in the past and they were excluded. I agree net zero worked very well. So if that's your good model, I get that. Under urban prototyping and tactical urbanism, I certainly, knowing UTIL's work, although it wasn't mentioned here, public space, crosswalks, infrastructure, building massing, street network is a given. Good, I assume that. We talk about shared vision, but is this visual, is this verbal shared vision? We don't say what shared vision represents. Is it just in text? Or does it actually, I don't see how you can have a shared vision and people say, yes, that's what I believe it is, unless it's something that's drawn and clear, or at least in pictures, and conveys a message. We could interpret 100 different ways, the 100 people in this room, if it's verbal. So I'm hoping it's beyond, doesn't say what it is. I'm hoping it's way beyond just being verbal.
Some of that will evolve as we go through the process, but we certainly think that there will be visual components to this in addition to verbal.
Okay. Sure. Tim, go ahead.
Part of the vision might be articulated with indicators too, goals about mode share, goals about population growth after we model scenarios for development. So I think that data-driven indicators might be also a way to articulate the vision.
Sure. And you have current CET methods, and I have no doubt the current CET methods are good, but you might want to tell us someday what those are. And I know people who work for you, with you, and I'm sure they're very good, but just to say CET is, at least for me, sounds good, but I don't know what they are.
I'll invite Ellen Semenoff to speak to that.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, actually, you do know, I think you just aren't identifying it with this, so give yourself more credit here. I think it's, this is the group of representatives of different diverse communities, with particularly diverse linguistic communities, who work part-time for the Department of Human Service Programs and who work in reaching deeply into their communities, and it's also an opportunity to help support leadership within those communities.
Thank you. Now I know what it is, but I didn't identify it with CET. I could imagine many different things that CET stands for. Circus entertainer, no. So I'm almost done. Shaping and managing urban change, community character. I just wanted to emphasize that. I spoke to Tim earlier and said, absolutely, that's in there. And I'm assuming it's in here when we have tasks for alternative scenarios. Just identifying areas of likely change is obvious, but it's not listed. And that will tell us what needs to be done in those areas. Almost done here. And I would say that the final goal in each of these scenarios, or these areas where change is going to occur, is an urban design vision. So people can buy into that. That will save everybody heartache later on, including people in this room. That things will change, but you at least have that as a goal and an understanding of what we're talking about. And finally, I sound like I'm picking and choosing, but this is an 11-page document, and most of it is right on the money. Under design strategies, there's no page number. The sentence says, these approaches may also include streetscape or complete streets guidelines. I don't know why the word may is in there. State-of-the-art is will include, and I hope that has changed. And there's a comment that alewife conclusions might not be relevant to other areas. Well, I would suggest that's not true, given that 1/3 of the city's in a flood-prone zone. I would say that the opposite. I would say things that we learn in detail there might be very useful for Area 4, parts of Cambridgeport, East Cambridge. It might be hard to implement, but they would be very relevant. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Rossi, did you have a couple of quick closing comments?
Just that this is the beginning of what will be a long and I think very interesting and, engaging process with the community, with the council, with, various groups, with other city departments. And it's a real opportunity for us to look in depth in a lot of areas. And I'm pleased that the consultant, is willing to think along with us that way. And I just think this is something that, as we stated before, all these plans we have do have utility, so they don't just sit on a shelf. Those plans have been the action plan for many years in many programs and get referred to. This, I think, will be the same. It will prove to us, though, that I think you can't do one and then just let it sit. You do have to update them periodically. So I'm looking forward to this.
So I think what you hear here tonight is a lot of excitement, a lot of ideas, and I think a willingness by the council to participate in this process as it goes forward. And I'm going to throw in one more idea that, as we did a silver ribbon committee that also looked at aging in Cambridge. And, I think that many people don't feel like there are aging alternatives in our city. And I will say that if you look at Lexington and look at the private firm that's out there, but Brookhaven, for example, that has multi-level opportunities for people to live, that's possible still here in Cambridge. And I'll tell you where it's possible off-site. But I mean, it's, I think that we need to kind of think, and that's what I mean when we are involving all people in the community, in all ages of people in the community, because there are some groups that may not be able to quite advocate on behalf of themselves, and we're going to have to do that for them. But with that,
I would just tack on to that. We just had a meeting last week about the homeless population in Cambridge. As we talk about housing, and as housing is, the pie is only so large, and there's lots of various needs for housing. I'm really concerned that our homeless population, that if any group doesn't have much of a voice in the community, it's them. So, I hope we look at all different types of housing that we need in the city, and there are going to be some, we're not going to be able to do it all, and there'll be some things we can do and some things we can't, but that's another group I certainly want to make sure is involved.
well, thank you. And with that, the chair will accept a motion to adjourn from Councilor McGovern, who has candy in his mouth. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Thank you very much for coming.